Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the final presentation of our summit, and which I know is going to be a great one. I am Jim Wilkerson with the Illinois Department of Human Services Division of Substance Use Prevention and Recovery, and I have the pleasure of introducing Jody Bechtold. Jody is the CEO of the Better Institute. She serves as the Vice President of the Board for the International Gambling Counselor Certification Board and is a highly regarded gambling addiction expert. Jolie holds a master's degree in social work from the University of Pittsburgh School of Social Work and has certifications as a board-approved clinical consultant and internationally certified gambling counselor level 2 with IGCCB. Most recently, she is the co-author of the Gambling Disorder Treatment Handbook, a guide for mental health professionals. So welcome, Jody.
Thank you, Jim. I really appreciate the introduction, and hello to everyone out there. Thank you for sticking around for the last session of the summit. It's a really exciting one. We're going to talk about ethics. But I can assure you we're going to cover some really new stuff for you. I'm going to be active in chat as well. And thank you, Doug, for the shout out about my book. That was super sweet of you. So let's go ahead and get started. Just for illustration and for, to be transparent, this is a training that's only informational. It's not intended as any legal or ethical advice. And as practitioners, we are responsible for seeking peer consultation, supervision, and getting legal guidance for very specific situations. So here's a little bit more about me. I know Jim did a fantastic job of introducing me. Just really wanted to, let you put a name with a face from, and that I'm a social worker, really excited to talk about ethics. I know that doesn't sound like an exciting topic, but we'll get to that today. If you want, you can take out your smartphone and hover over the QR code and join my mailing list. I promise I don't send out a lot of mailings. Just want to keep everybody informed of things as they're happening. I do have a series of webinars on gambling treatment. So a lot of what I do is for clinicians by clinicians. And I do have my new Gambling Disorder Treatment Handbook available on Amazon. And there's the cover of it, just came out March for Problem Gambling Awareness Month. And let's talk about what we're going to do today. We're really going to look at the HIPAA privacy rule and how it applies to psychotherapy notes, particularly for gambling treatment, problem gambling treatment, but it can apply to all of your clinical work. We're going to look at the challenges related to privacy and the use of technology. And we're going to explore current technology and the ethical issues that might come from that related to anything from boundaries, confidentiality, privacy, informed consent. And the most important one that we're going to focus on today is competence. And so with that, go ahead and put in the chat, how many ethics trainings have you attended in your professional lifetime? Right? Because we all need ethics for our, our license. Yep, so many. I know somebody one time put 10,000. It does feel like a lot, too many to count. Excellent. So I'm in the same boat. I've attended a lot of ethics. We get to do that every 2 years in Pennsylvania. I'm sure it's the same across many of the states. But let's talk about it from a little bit different lens so that it's not the same old, ethics. We all know we're not supposed to, have sex or relations with our clients. So we don't need to go over that one today. Okay. But really, there's a couple different ways to think about ethics and the decision-making that goes into it. We're going to look at professional ethics versus the legal mandated ethics, just briefly touch upon that. And when you do any literature searches, there's various models you can apply to ethical decision making. It can either be from a theoretical or philosophical framework, it can be from a practice base or a specialty practice. And so we'll look today through the lens of specialty practice as well as through our codes of ethics. And each professional body has their own code of ethics, but they're actually relatively similar when we look at it. And so here, the professional ethics versus the legal, right? We know we have a duty to warn and we have to handle things related to suicide. And those are things that can become legal or involved in the legal system if we do or do not do our job correctly. And then there's the professional ethics where we get into situations and we need to decide how to handle an ethical dilemma. Okay. So I love this map because I don't know if you guys knew this, but across the country, there are variations in the duty to warn, duty to protect. Okay. And so what you can see here is that majority of the states blue, it's mandatory to do the duty to warn, duty to protect. Okay. And that says that you will get into trouble if you do not, do the duty to warn and notify. But there's also some green states, and that's considered permissive. And I don't know how many of you have noticed the distinction. And with permissive, it's not necessarily that you would, cause harm or get into trouble if you did breach confidentiality, or you wouldn't get into trouble or harm if you didn't breach confidentiality. So you can see the gray areas. And I don't know if you realize there's a couple states that don't even have duty to warn mandates across the state. Okay. But notice in the blue, there's some text that says Arizona, Delaware, and Illinois have different duties for different professions. So even within the mandatory, there can be differences. So a social worker versus a licensed professional counselor, or even in the medical side, could have different rules to follow. So I say this, and why is it timely? Because when we think about digital, we've all now experienced teletherapy. We really have to think if we get licensed in more than one state, we're going to really need to know, is this a mandatory or permissive or none? And is it different based on our profession? So that is our obligation when we choose to get licensed in multiple states, to know what the duty to warn is. Okay. And there's various models, right? We talked about the theoretical or the philosophical. Those tend to be grounded in theory, based on our training, our knowledge. They can be much more of an integrative model. You might see that related to maybe interdisciplinary care, maybe for older adults, something like that. There's also practice-based, whether you were from counseling or from social work, and then the specialty practice, whether it's, examples are couples counseling. And for me and for all of us today, we're going to zero in on gambling disorder counseling and what are those various models and how do we look at that. And so here, I'm going to quickly take you through a little walk of some codes of ethics, whether it's the National Association of Social Workers, the Association of Counseling, APA for Psychology, and the International Gambling Counselor Certification Board also has a code of ethics. And these codes of ethics, just for a variety of ways of looking at them, they have their ethical principles and their ethical standards. And so examples of principles is the respect for autonomy, and the benevolence and the non-malevolence. I'd like to say those and kind of butcher those because they're hard to say. And the standards, right? Here's our confidentiality, our privacy, what is considered privileged communication. I want you all to be looking at your informed consents and what do you have in those? And overall, are you competent in what you are working in and what you are doing? Okay. And here we have the famous ethical dilemma, right? And I always say, is it a dilemma or is it a clinical challenge? Because when it's an ethical dilemma, we know that the information is complete, that the values have been clarified, and there are two or more standards or policies or values that apply to the situation. They might come across equally compelling and they conflict with one another. And so in our general day-to-day profession, sometimes we refer to things as an ethical dilemma. But the real challenge is to say, is it really an ethical dilemma? Or is it a clinical challenge? Because a clinical challenge is difficult or messy to implement the standards. And oftentimes the information is not complete and or we haven't clarified the values. And so many, many times we are dealing with clinical challenges, not ethical dilemmas. And so when we do peer supervision, we talk with our supervisor, a lot of times we're working to get more information so that it is complete. And then it becomes much more evident which step or which path we need to take, right? And so again, most situations that we're in are clinical challenges, not ethical dilemmas, right? Because we're able to apply the model and quickly understand what we need to do next, either based on our code of ethics, based on the profession in general, and what we have with our policies and procedures, right? When it is an ethical dilemma, there's lots of different models that you can apply. And so I like to use this one. It's not that it's better or worse than another one. It's just one that I seem to find works well in a clinical setting. It's really where we start by identifying what is the issue, what is the ethical issue, the principle, anything like that, the values and the duties that might be in conflict. Now we have to go gather more information, and then we seek consultation. And right here is that point where oftentimes it becomes a clinical challenge and we're able to know what to do. But when it is truly an ethical dilemma, that consultation will then reveal what are the different options that we need to identify. We need to then select one of those, implement it, and the most important, but the one that a lot of times people don't do, is evaluate and document the outcome. What was the outcome of that dilemma, and what was the impact, okay? So this is a model that tends to be rather simple in just our everyday professional application, but it is worth having written down somewhere or saved on your computer just to review. Okay. And so in the chat, go ahead and put, what are some of the ethical situations that you have faced? And remember, we're not looking at clinical challenges. We're looking at those ethical situations. Many of us will see some of the very same ethical situations over and over again. So go ahead and put those in the chat. Let's see what you guys come up with. Oftentimes it can be, child lining someone. Good. Supervising boundary issues. Excellent. Absolutely dealing with suicide. Somebody mentioned a coworker. We're going to get into, competence, the confidentiality and the privacy. Excellent. Boundaries. Okay. A lot of them tend to be more of the legal side, the suicidality, anything related to dual relations, having to potentially report another colleague in our profession to a board. For ethics, great. You guys are putting some really good stuff here. Really good. The dual relations comes up a lot. Depends on if you are in a more rural setting. I know we've dealt with that in the past, just because we do have multiple roles in a smaller geographical region. Okay. Excellent. You guys are doing great. Okay, so you'll see these are the same ones over and over again. So again, not as many times do we have to deal with ethical situations. Most of the time it is a clinical dilemma. Okay, so thank you guys for being so active in the chat. All right, so let's take a deeper dive into code of ethics, just so that we're all kind of on the same page when we talk about competence. All right, and so the question is it ethical to treat gambling disorders without formal training and certification, right? Go ahead and put in the chat, yes or no. Is it ethical to treat gambling disorders without that formal training and certification? Would we do the same with other disorders, right? And so the majority of time, we're going to say no. Excellent. Most of you are doing that, right? And then there's going to be those times when we didn't know that an individual had a gambling disorder. They came to us for another reason. It could have been financial stress, relationship issues. And then we encounter this. And so here with, especially for today and yesterday with this summit, it really illustrates how important it is that we go out and get more training and even pursue certification, because we're going to have more and more people that show up on our caseload and in our agencies that might present for another problem, and the underlying issue can be a gambling disorder, or at least problematic and at-risk gambling. Right? And so you're going to see a little bit through these different codes of ethics how we handle this. I like to zero in on competence. All right. And competence, just out of the basic Webster's dictionary, the quality or state of having sufficient knowledge, judgment, skill, or strength, right? For a particular, and sorry, I have my windows open, particular area, in particular respect, right? And when we look then, we'll start with NASW. The ethical principles really say that we have to practice within our areas of competence, right? And that we should aspire to contribute that knowledge in the profession and things like that. But that we need to provide services and represent ourselves, right? Only within those boundaries of the education, the training and things, and the certification that we have received, that we've actually gone after to obtain. And we should also only engage in doing certain interventions or techniques after we've had appropriate study, training, consultation, supervision, any of those, right, that involve interventions or techniques. And so we have that responsibility to our clients, that we say we are practicing within our scope, within our practice area. And we will take reasonable steps to get more education, more training, understand the research to make sure that we do not do anything to put anyone at harm, that we are protecting clients from that harm as well. Right? And what I like here from the APA is you're going to start to see the same types of wording. It is not okay to practice outside your boundaries of competence. You must undertake that relevant training, that relevant education, whatever that is. And I like to talk about this because when we talk about technology or the digital space, how many of us really went out of our way to take a lot of trainings and a lot of courses? We kind of fumbled our way through some of the technology because it was just kind of pushed on us, or we got immersed into it. And here, again, if there's a new specialty area, right, you need to only practice after you've had appropriate education, training, and supervised experience. And I know that it's a question for all of us. What about gaming? What about video gaming? What about that tech use? We are coming up and embarking on a whole nother disorder that will be making it into the next DSM if we have our way. And then we've got to make sure that we get the training and education for that as well. And last, when I look at the International Gambling Certification Board, we also stress not only through the training to become certified, but that individuals must continue that ongoing education to remain competent as a professional, right? And so I'm not telling anybody anything new, right? We're just packaging it a little bit differently through the lens of gambling disorders and gambling treatment. And so then we come to that intersection of that convergence of where technology and the ethical standards meet. All right. NASW came out with the standards for technology back in 2007. I know that the ACA also had some standards, so I'm not saying that NASW was first, but really they decided that it was really important to start to address the intersection and the incorporation of technology in our practice, in our social work, both at the micro and at the macro level. And one of the areas, right, there's 4 different sections of this standard talking about the provision of information to the public, how do we design and deliver our services, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to focus on designing and delivering services. Now, this could help you no matter what in your practice, but also I want you to think about it with expanding into the gambling treatment space and what you might also be sharing there. We're going to look at the use of that electronic media, the information as storage, emails, smartphones, there's our favorite, teletherapy, and any other software use, okay? So again, going back to competence, the NASW's technology standards talks again about how you use technology, again, when you have the necessary knowledge and skills and you can provide in these services in a competent manner. So somewhere along the line, we really needed to make sure we had enough training so that we could be deemed competent, right? And so the themes that start to emerge when we see this intersection is a lot of times the values and standards are the same, but we need to actually think a lot more critically about the technology we use or the way we use technology to accomplish our clinical goals, right? And you have to ask yourself, how competent or confident are you with regards to technology? You know, take a moment and say, were you really confident in doing video or teletherapy before the pandemic? Right? And think of the different webinars that people attended rather quickly to make sure that they understood the do's and don'ts related to teletherapy. And I know that, you know, some of us were just really thrown into it and didn't have a lot of practice. And so we kind of fumbled our way in those first few weeks or months, right? But then what about, you know, do you also add as part of your continuing education any technology related skill building? What are you doing when you think about your professional development in the next coming year or in the next licensing season? What are you doing that incorporates technology, right? And my favorite, right? What are your interpersonal skills in working with technology specialists? So depending on the size of the agency or the organization you work in, do you wear multiple hats and sometimes you're the IT person as well? Or do you have an agency large enough that you have someone that's in the technology space? And how often do you interact with them? And in what ways do you interact with them? Because as we continue, we know that especially after what the pandemic showed us, as we continue, we're always going to need to make sure we're staying up on those technology skills and working with technology specialists. And at an organization level, what policies do you have related to social media, related to how you handle electronic data or PHI, and any ways that you communicate with your clients or patients? And are these also consistent with what we're showing in the codes of ethics and technology standards? And do you have tech people that you bring into decision making, right? So sometimes when we think about interdisciplinary teams, we think of maybe clinicians, psychologists, and psychiatrists. Do we ever think about bringing the technology specialists into a meeting? Because if we're thinking about a new software to use, a new way, there's a couple of different tools we use for problem gambling. Do we bring them into it to make sure they have fully vetted that we can use it in a safe way and with competence? So these are all some pretty interesting questions that the majority of people will probably say, I hadn't thought about the role of the technology specialist in quite that way. So hopefully that opens your eyes today to considering that, right? And so we'll start with the privacy rule, right? What do you know about the privacy rule? Everybody says, yes, I know the privacy rule. I've heard of the HIPAA privacy rule, but can you recite it back to me? Can you say, this is what the privacy rule is? Go ahead and give me a shout out in the chat, yes or no, that you can, with confidence, say what the privacy rule is. Yep. Nope. Right? Excellent. Thank you guys for being so honest during an ethics training. That means a lot. Okay, so let's go ahead and see what this says. And it will probably surprise you. So the privacy rule under HIPAA generally protects, right, treats all protected health information uniformly. with the exception of psychotherapy notes. Okay, these receive greater protections against disclosure, right? If they're met with that strict definition set out in HIPAA and they're kept separate from a medical record. There's the source, because when I do this, sometimes people are like, what? And so the conversation sometimes goes, well, do you guys all remember when we had paper forms and then we got a request to release information to maybe a funder or insurer or payer, and we had to photocopy our notes and send them in, right? How many of you have done something like that in your past, where you have just had to photocopy what you had, and because you thought you had a release of information, it was okay to send everything in? Okay. Put that in the chat if you're thinking about it. I know early in my career, back in the day when we did the paper, I probably was guilty of this as well. Okay. It does help when you're in an organization and you have a department or someone has that role or title and they help. But when you're an individual practitioner, maybe in private practice, this is where you might actually slip up a little bit without even realizing it. Okay. And so really what this is saying is that psychotherapy notes, when they are by a healthcare provider, okay, who is a mental health professional documenting or analyzing the contents of a conversation during a private counseling session or a group or even a family session, they are separate from the rest of the medical record. Okay. I don't know if any of you have that, but when we move into the technology space, this can actually help us maintain following the privacy rule. Okay. And so I give an example with a screenshot in a minute. But again, these are treated very differently, regardless of who's asking. Okay. And they are the personal notes of you that are, you keep. And so then people start to say, well, what do I keep? Did anybody write in the margins back in the day on paper, or did they truly keep two separate sets of notes, your progress note and your psychotherapy note? Okay. Because we didn't always get taught the right thing. We didn't always understand how these were separate. And the mental health part of HIPAA was the last to be fully implemented, and also is the most strict of all of HIPAA. And if you work in a health system before, I'll talk about, like in California, for example, there's a big system, Kaiser Permanente, and they did a big thing about open notes. And what is released. Well, that comes into challenge then when you have open notes between medical professionals and mental health professionals. Because again, do you, as a mental health professional, let a medical professional see your psychotherapy notes? And according to this definition, no, you cannot. You do not. Right. And so that whole concept of break the glass that people were thinking about, how do we break the glass so that we have more information so that we can treat the whole person? This becomes that challenge, or potentially an ethical dilemma. Okay. And so here's an example when you have either a DAP or a SOAP note versus your psychotherapy note. I always say to people, do you know the difference, right? Progress notes are really the progress, what was the data, what's your assessment, what's the plan kind of thing, what's the objective information you've collected, which is different than what is your impression, the things you want to be thinking about. Sometimes it might be thinking about an additional diagnosis. You're either ruling it out, it's provisional in some way. You might be making a comment that you really want to make sure. It might be about childhood sexual trauma or abuse. Those are things you might put in your psychotherapy note as opposed to a progress note. And practice management software can really help keep these things separate. And so here's an example of what I use, and I'm not promoting Simple Practice at all. It just seems to be the thing that works really well at the size of my group practice. And you can see on one screen, there are two separate sections, a progress note and a psychotherapy note. You can also see that it says keep separate from the client record next to psychotherapy note. And so I tested this and I exported a client record to see all the information that would be exported, and none of the psychotherapy notes were exported. So you can't even access it, outside of reviewing it in the software. So that was kind of a helpful test to look at that. But it's something for all of you to think about and to go back to your practice on Monday, as well as applying everything you've learned through this great summit, and think where, do I need to polish up my my policies and procedures based on this? Are my staff trained? Is there anything else we can do? And I say this from the lens of problem gambling, because problem gambling as a disorder is not protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act the same way that substance use disorders are. Right. And so there might be times when you're treating an individual for another disorder and you start to learn more about gambling. That's where you would talk about it in your psychotherapy notes. All right. In addition to that, how many of you have recommended the use of apps in your treatment with clients? There's a lot of different apps out there, a lot of general ones, but there might be some specific uses for problem gambling as well as other addictions, right? And we have to make sure that we understand what the app really does and how we use that with a client is going to be important. And you can see this would be an opportunity to bring in that technology specialist to make sure that they've also vetted this, because you want to know what would be, how would they handle a data breach? What does that company do? So just because it's an app in the App Store or Google Play doesn't mean that it has followed all of the things that we need it to in the mental health space. And so again, great. I see in the chat, Insight Timer. That's an excellent meditation app, and it's free. Right. That's another big thing for me is, obviously with problem gambling, a lot of individuals don't have finances at the time that they're coming to see us to be spending monthly subscriptions for things. And so Insight Timer is all about meditation, but how you use it with problem gambling and gambling disorders is wonderful because it helps people with that mindfulness, right? And so it can really be a great use of technology in between sessions. Okay. And so Jim is saying you can document progress notes in a clinical record, but not psychotherapy notes. What do you use with those? The psychotherapy notes are really just your clinical notes that you want to keep for yourself. Maybe it's helping you to see things over time with a client. You're not sure if they meet criteria for another disorder, so you don't want that to be in the progress note. And really, the progress note is something that is pointing back to a treatment plan and the client's goals. All right. And so hopefully that helps with some of that confusion. But thank you, Jim, for that. Yes. And so thank you for, I think it's Mike. Apps also collect data about users. And my big thing is don't ever recommend an app you haven't tried yourself. And that doesn't mean you just downloaded it and entered your name. It means you've tried it for like a week. You've seen if there were lots of in-ad purchases and all that kind of stuff, because those in-app purchases oftentimes can then become gambling related. And we don't want, obviously, to be working with someone with at-risk, problematic, or a gambling disorder, and then is being triggered with those in-app purchases. So we could spend a whole workshop talking about all kinds of different apps and how to use those. But I really want you to think, when you get that app, you download it and you're supposed to read the user agreement, and you just kind of scroll through and hit agree. In there is where it talks about a data breach and how they would handle it. So if you don't want to read it, can you get your technology specialist to really vet it is another thing to think about. Okay. And I like to do this because and this is a slide, if I type depression in the App Store, this at one point in time is what I saw. And you could do the same exercise at some point, but you'll see different things. And when you really look at this, not all of them specifically target depression. And so again, what does our client oftentimes get exposed to? What do they see? What is their worldview? And is it really helping? Sanvello is a really good one for depression and anxiety. Calm and Headspace also focus on that, but they're very meditation focused, right? Talkspace has been discussed a lot, has a lot of public figures endorsing it. But what do they really do? And how do they address depression? Or do they address depression? So these are things that I like to actually do these exercises with my client, because I want to show them I have the confidence and the competence to really understand which ones are better for what the client is trying to achieve and which ones aren't so helpful. I also like to use the use of some apps because it helps clients in between sessions gain more knowledge or gain more objective information about themselves. So if someone comes in after 7 days and they're like, I did okay this week, but really they were charting their mood and only 2 out of the 7 days their mood was low, you're able to have more objective data that says, yeah, but you charted 5 days where you were really good. What was going on with those days? And then it really helps clients learn to monitor their symptoms and be a little bit more objective. So let's do some takeaways, right? I'm going to want you to review your informed consent policies and share with your colleagues, share with your supervisor, anything like that as part of a takeaway from this workshop today. Here's what we're going to look at. With informed consent, okay, part of the technology standards said that we as social workers, which you can put anybody's, professional title there, should discuss with clients your policies regarding technology in the provision of your professional services. And you need to obtain that client consent before doing any type of electronic search on a client, right? And this could show up as an exception if we have that mandatory duty to warn or for any other compelling professional reason. Now, when I do this in other trainings, I've had people say, I've actually Googled and I've looked on Facebook clients' names and tried to search out their family because the client had dementia and I didn't have the right paperwork because they didn't know how to fill it out. And you can really hear this like, ooh, we got to slow down and we've got to make sure that anytime we've ever used any type of electronic search, we already have consent or our supervisor has said, yes, this is for the right reason. And I also say this because a younger generation with millennials and Gen Zs oftentimes just always go to tech and don't really understand or think about the ethical situations related to the profession. So what does your informed consent say about technology? In the chat, tell me if you know off the top of your head that your informed consent specifically calls out how you use technology and what it says. So go ahead and put that in the chat. Yep, some people are saying yes. Some people say no. Wonderful. I like those yeses. Okay, great. Some are saying it's specific to telehealth, right? About texting, about phone calls. Perfect. You guys are on it. Okay, so let's kind of dive deeper into that. What do you say about social media in your informed consent? Do you ever say anything about Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram? And if you have a practice or an agency that also does social media, which is very popular, do you have anything about social media related to that? Okay. All over the map is what I'm getting here. Okay, wonderful. Perfect. So here's an example of my social media policy for illustration purposes. We actually talk about how we don't accept friend or any other invitations for current or former clients on anything such as Facebook, LinkedIn, right? And we specifically state that we think that by doing that could compromise their confidentiality and their respective privacy. It also blurs those boundaries of the therapeutic relationship. And so we say also then go on and say, please don't use text messaging or any messaging on those sites to get in touch with our therapists, right? It's not secure. We might not read it in a timely fashion, anything like that. We give them what we do ask. Here's a phone number, here's an email, this is what you can do. Now, why do we say all of this? Because clients are going to do this anyways, right? That's what they know is tech. That's what they're comfortable with. They're going to do it anyways. And then it's our opportunity to say, we talked about this in our first appointment. Let me remind you, I can't protect your confidentiality when you do things on social media. And it's more important that we have said, please don't do it. Here's another alternative so that if something happens, we're not solely liable for that breach. We have done what we can, right? And that's better than not putting anything in your informed consent at all. When you don't have anything, then you're not actually guiding clients as to what is more appropriate in their behavior and how they communicate. So definitely look at what you have over, when you go back on Monday and see if there's anything else you might want to add to it. Okay. How about emails? Right? We use emails only to arrange or modify appointments, right? You can opt out of receiving our newsletter. And please, whatever you do, don't email your therapist content about your therapy session, because while email is not completely secure or confidential. And then we say, if you choose to do this by email, be aware that emails contain the logs of you and your therapist's internet provider. So the internet provider is something we don't have control over. And while it's unlikely that someone would look at those logs, in theory, they could. And so again, please don't do this because we can't protect you and we can't protect your confidentiality when you do this, okay? And it could become part of a legal therapy record. Do they want that? By slowing down and having these conversations with clients, it's so important. Now, think about this also in the context of gambling disorders, right? Again, if gambling disorder is not recognized by ADA, you don't want anything related to gambling and seeking help to compromise them through their employment. So what if they used their work email and then they started to talk about, their urges and cravings or triggers or anything like that related to gambling? So we've got to really go all the way down the path and help clients see how, while tech is great and we like tech, here are the things that are not appropriate in mental health. Okay. And texting. Oh, how many of you have had clients text you and you're like, what? Right? Why am I getting this? Thank you for putting the links in the chat. This is wonderful. So make sure you guys check that out. Texting is a real challenge. It's not covered under confidentiality laws. You have to use a special app to make texting confidential. And how many clients, especially the younger ones, do you know that would do that? We also provide that texting feature through Simple Practice, but I'll tell you, they don't use it that often. I can tell you that people will reach out, they will text any of us, and I use it as a therapeutic and teaching opportunity to say to clients, please don't text with this information. I can't protect your confidentiality. We'll discuss this in our next session or something like that. Or I'll pick up the phone if it's obviously an urgent information. But we've got to constantly role model to our clients what is appropriate and what is not through the mental health lens, not the medical. So that whole telemedicine is very different than teletherapy, right? And so considering that. Now, this is a funny one because I don't know with COVID if anybody really cares because everybody, wasn't in their office. But an example here is I'm in an office building that is predominantly mental health or medical. All right. And I've told clients, be careful if you have location-based services on where you like to check in everywhere and you have different apps that kind of say, I checked in at this restaurant today, and that kind of stuff. because I can't actually protect someone and their confidentiality if their social media is saying that they checked into this address and someone Googled the address and saw it's primarily mental health and or medical. And so I walk clients through that and I just say, please be very mindful about location-based services or however you like to check in, because I don't want you to be doing that when you come to my office. In the days of COVID, in the days of teletherapy, this might have a totally different meaning, but we really want to think about that. And for the same for us, what do you have on your personal phone? What do does it show things that you might not realize that you're checking in or that people can easily find where you are? So other stuff to review. So I like to do a quick case story. So I had a 28-year-old single male who was my client for a gambling problem. His goal was total abstinence. We had a lot of family involvement. And after 9 months, he had done really, really well. And he had stopped, therapy because we both agreed it was time. So we fast forward. Several months later, it's the month of December, it's a Sunday night, and I get a text from the mother requesting I call back immediately. Then before I can do anything, the client calls but doesn't leave me a voicemail. Next thing I know, the mother's on LinkedIn requesting to connect and leaving me an in-mail message. Please call me frantically, call me. And I simply texted back, it's Sunday night, I'm with family. If it's an emergency, call 911 or go to the nearest ER. So what do you guys think the mom did next? Go ahead and put in the chat what you think happened, right? Because we've all been there to a lesser or greater degree, okay? Yep, called, okay, texted again, great. Yeah. So typically we would expect something like continued, pursuing. Yeah, she actually said, I'm so sorry. Thank you for having such good professional boundaries. We will talk tomorrow. And I was like, wow. Right. But I'm glad that I was setting those boundaries with her. And again, I was in a lowest level of care. And so it wasn't appropriate for me. If it was really, really urgent, they would maybe need to go to, call 911 or the nearest ER. Really, the issue was that the mom found out that the son had relapsed. That was the issue. And, I'm not sure what I could have done on a Sunday night compared to a Monday morning. Right. And so I give you this because their emergency and the way that they'll reach out in a state of crisis is not always an emergency or crisis to us. So think about how you might respond to those. Doing nothing, I don't agree with. I think setting the boundaries more important. Okay. How many of you have Googled a potential client or Googled a current client? Right. Go ahead and you don't have to put in the chat. You can just think about it. We forget that we go to Google for a lot of things. And if you have actually Googled a potential client or a current client, this really shows up if you have students, master's level students doing internships. Do you have anything in your policies and procedures reminding them not to do this? When you're in certain settings like CYS and stuff like that, I know it's definitely documented not to do this, but there could be other settings where it's just kind of, they don't have anything written. They didn't go over it. And what makes it unethical, right? There's a lot that makes it unethical, right? Because you can kind of see into someone and then you're not objective when you first meet them, right? But when is it appropriate to do this? Right? It's another clinical challenge, isn't it? Under what circumstances would it be appropriate? Right? So not sure about that, but I always say, how does this apply to millennials and Gen Zs? They're used to the the tech. They're used to doing those things. And so it doesn't even occur to them as they're entering this profession or in this profession, sometimes where the boundaries need to be. But I want you to Google yourself and see what shows up, because clients are Googling you before they become your client. And so that'll be another homework exercise that you can do next week. Okay. All right. And so just again, I wanted to reiterate, sorry, this slide must have gotten out of order. But with the mental health apps, with any of the software, what are the apps collecting? How do they handle those data breaches? And only recommend after you have tested them yourself. All right. Okay, so I know we're covering a lot in a very short amount of time, want to stay on course. Social proofing works. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but marketing and advertising really big on social proofing. It's get as many testimonials as you possibly can. So I was at the dermatologist for a skin check, and I took this picture that said, check us out on Facebook, stay up to date, and leave us your feedback. Now, why would I want to tell anyone that I was at the dermatologist for a skin check, right? I wouldn't. But you forget how taking social proofing in other industries somehow is creeping into medical and mental health. And we have to really kind of challenge, what's the purpose for this? Why are we doing this? Now, what really is happening here is that this practice, I learned, is very well known for their Botox services. And I think that's what they were really trying to target, not people who were doing skin checks to make sure they didn't have any cancerous skin cancer, right? But it does show you that this is showing up everywhere. And do you have a company Facebook page, an agency Facebook page, and what is on there? What can people do? Can they leave information, or is it strictly one way? Right? This stuff keeps changing constantly. Where is our technology specialist involved in the decision-making of these types of things is going to be continuously important as we continue on in this very tech world. And so with that social proofing, there has been some talk about how it's really not a good thing to get testimonials regarding your practice, because it actually could come across as some sort of subjecting them to undue influence. Some people will say, leave us a review after you've finished services, but you know what? Once a client, always a client. They might need to come back at some point, like my example with the 28-year-old. And so let me stress again, those marketing ideas that work well in other industries should not always apply to behavioral health and mental health. And our younger generation that is so good with social media, it needs to understand where we have to draw the line. So I did an example, and this is strictly to not to be, do anything negative to anyone, because we're all in this together and we need to help each other. All right. But here is a treatment facility in Lake County, Illinois. And I tried to crop some things, but they got a 3.1 rating for Google reviews. All right. And so this illustrates why we want to stay on top of testimonials and get rid of them, because this can happen to any of us at any time. What you're seeing here is 3 stars and then 5 stars. But what you're also seeing is people's names, right? And again, we are responsible for protecting our clients' confidentiality. So if we give them a space to leave a review, are we still protecting their confidentiality? No. And even though they might want to leave a review, and I've done this training before where I've been able to show across the board 1 star to 5 stars, the most wonderful experience, the worst experience ever, all within a similar time frame. And so reviews in mental health are not helpful. So check out your own webpage, check out on Google, and see if you have any reviews you didn't even know existed and what you might need to do about those. Now, this is also important if you are promoting, and I often do with my group practice, that we are here to help individuals with a gambling addiction or a gambling disorder or at risk or problematic gambling. It's always showing up. Now, if you see that and then you read testimonials, someone could deduce that someone might be seeing me for a gambling problem. And then we go back to ADA and all of those things, okay? So again, it has a very rippling effect, okay? And my favorite picture, the internet remembers. Once it's out there, it's out there. how, again, how do you implement all of this to protect your clients, and who is your technology specialist, right? All right, so let's kind of review. I know I went really fast, but we want time for Q&A. Always think, is it ethical dilemma or a clinical challenge? Because the majority of time it's clinical challenge. Where is your area of competence in your profession, and how are you going to increase competence in either gambling treatment, the intersection with technology? Where do you need to actually do more to maintain a high level of competence? Review the privacy rule with your staff, with your team, how you're doing things with your release informed consent. And what does your informed consent say? Please review it and then go through and kind of almost rehearse, how am I going to hit these main points with every new client that I meet, so that I can document that I have not only given it to them to read, but we've discussed it. Because then if something happens, I've at least talked about and gone out of my way to make sure that they understood it, if they then choose to still email or text or something I can't protect. And always respect the power of Google and what Google can do. Okay, especially in this rapidly text world. So let's leave time for question answer. And Jim, I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jody. And I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll real quick. So just as a reminder to everyone, this is our attendance poll. So please go ahead and click on that. It won't be very difficult, but we want to make sure we click on that to get your attendance in. So also, while we're doing that, if you want to go ahead and put in any additional questions in the chat area, we can review those and go from there.
I know I covered a lot in less than 60 minutes.
That you did, but it was all very, very good information.
I told you ethics can be fun, right?
Exactly.
For those who have attended 10 or more, right?
So we've got a lot of great information, or a lot of great comments, I'll say it that way, coming through on the chat.
Yeah, the chat's been great. You guys have been fantastic with the chat today.
And I will say, I appreciate you answering that question a little bit earlier. That was on the Q&A side of things. So I want to pull that over in the chat. I didn't think you would be able to see that. So that was
not enough
good.
windows. Yeah, thank you.
Yep. All right. Well, as people are jumping through here, I'm not seeing any additional. Oh, wait, there is one question. Are texts from clients protected information?
Yeah. So again, that's a great point. And it would be an agency discussion, right? What are they on a need to know basis? And so sometimes they might need to know certain things because you're doing it to protect the client, right? And that would just be something to make sure that whoever your tech specialists are, that they also have some training around, HIPAA and how to protect that client information. But great point. You just really have to specifically call it out.
And a follow-up to that from lawyers et al. On the text.
On the text. Oh, what's the question? Tech people.
So on texts, we answered the question, are texts from clients protected information? Well, what about texts from lawyers or other providers, shall we say?
You still risk, information out there, because texting as a technology medium is not guaranteeing private, confidentiality protection. So you kind of have to start with the function itself. And that's why there's a lot of different apps out there that are for confidential texting, because they're saying they're protecting it. So just texting in general, I would be very leery of any information that comes through from anybody.
And a follow-up piece, can text be subpoenaed by lawyers, police, or government?
I believe so, but I'm not a lawyer. So I would, refer to your practice attorney and double check. But I do believe that, if there's an opportunity through phone records and things like that, and phone bills, that could be pulled. So it's
awesome.
possible.
All right. Well, thank you, Jody. That was great. It was a great presentation. And I really appreciate your time and being with us today. It was, as we expected, it was great overall, and we really appreciate it. It's a good way to end our overall summit. So
Wonderful. I put on the screen real quick, just Frederick Reamer is a fantastic guy to follow if you want to really understand technology and clinical and that intersection and where people actually get sloppy and get in trouble and then get pulled in front of the board. So he's got some great stuff as well. So thank you so much. Thank you,
awesome.
Jim, and thank you everyone for the summit and the invite.
Awesome. Thank you. And now I have just a few closing remarks, and then we will close up shop, so to speak, right at 1 o'clock there. So first, let me say, though, on behalf of Director David Jones, Deputy Director Stephanie Frank, and the Gambling Initiative team of Kelly Gage, Gadgev McNeil, Terrence Stone, the presenters, and myself, thank you for attending the 2021 Illinois Summit on Problem Gambling. It's been a very enlightening and motivating experience for me, and I certainly hope it has been for all of you as well. And I know that each of us has taken away many new insights to better our practices and serve the people of Illinois. A lot of hard work really goes into these events by many, many people that are on the background that you never see or hear from. So I just want to mention a few of those up front here. So let me acknowledge our partners at LifeWorks, formerly Morno Chappelle, including Ashley Trantham, Rabe Fukua, and our organizers, Arnie Walker and Asia Stevens, and our partners with the technical support team of DCPV 360. And finally, knowledge sharing venues such as this and providers such as everybody that is out there today, you really embolden my hope and excitement about the prospects for gambling, disorder prevention, and recovery in the future. Many times people attend conferences and learn a lot, but they fail to implement changes to their practice when they return to work on Monday. But I have to say, after what I've heard here today and yesterday and observed in the chats, I know that we will take what we've learned, we will apply it to our clinical and public health structures, our everyday interactions with gamblers and others, and we will make a difference in people's lives. So thank you again for attending. Have a great weekend, and I can't wait to see what you do on Monday.